Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library and Museum in Simi Valley, California, where we're covering the Reagan National Defense Forum. Our coverage here is sponsored by Leonardo DRS, and we have with us retired United States Air Force General Chuck Wald, who is the Vice Chairman for the Federal Practice at Deloitte. Sir, thanks very much for the time.
Good to see you, Vago.
It's always a pleasure. You and Ambassador Eric Edelman, who's at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, former Undersecretary of Policy, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the Bush administration, but also a career Foreign Service officer. You are on a group that looked at what America's strategy for Syria needs to be. Give us a synopsis on what you guys are arguing, because there's this sense that the caliphate has been defeated, but there's so much more work that has to be done, and you guys looked at that. Talk to us a little bit about what your key recommendations are.
Yeah, number one, the reason we're concerned is that there hasn't been a publicly articulated strategy for the next steps in Syria, we don't think, or we haven't heard it. And two is we need to have that if we're going to avert actually a hegemon regime from Iran, basically in the Middle East, which is the problem right now. So our recommendations were threefold. Number one, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action for the Iran nuclear program, is what it is. And frankly, in our study, we're not big fans of the JCPOA, but it's what it is. Our recommendation is now to work outside of that or in conjunction with it to, number one, enforce the sanctions that are already in place through the UN, but add to those. Number two, put blockades up or intercept any type of resupply for Hezbollah or the Yemeni Houthis, let's say, or Iranian forces that are either in Syria or in Yemen, for that matter. And then three, put up a very sophisticated, comprehensive missile defense capability in the Middle East to include our partners, which would be Saudi Arabia, the like-minded GCC countries, Jordan, Egypt, let's say, that can now start building a comprehensive, very sophisticated defense against Iranian missiles. And we already know what the problem in Korea was, or is, if you will. We got a little behind on that. And so our kind of three-pronged approach is to keep Iran in Iran where they belong and avoid basically a Hezbollah hegemony in the Middle East.
What do you think, though? I mean, H.R. McMaster, U.S. Army Lieutenant General, who's the National Security Advisor, was here and spoke. And one of the questions the moderator, Brett Baer of Fox News, asked him was, whether or not the working with Russia has actually given Assad a pass, whether or not Assad gets to control on that. H.R. Rejected that notion, and it was looking at that as one of the key pieces to get to an eventual solution. What do you think about what the National Security Advisor said?
Well, I liked what he said broadly about Russia. We'd like to make sure Russia's behavior is watched through different sanctions and watch their what's called hybrid warfare doesn't become pretty much the strategic norm in Ukraine, Crimea, and other places. Two was the fact that they are supporting people that are trying to kill our own forces in the Middle East. And his point there was, we're not going to put up with that if we know they're violating our security and our people's lives wantingly. We need to do something about it. And the third part was to cooperate where we have common interests. I would say personally that Russia has early on been given a free ride in Syria. There's no reason they should have ever been bombing anybody in Syria, particularly with not very sophisticated weaponry. And number two is they've got themselves in a position now where they do have influence in the Middle East, but long term, and the real battle, I think, for the United States is who is going to be the most influential partner in the Middle East. Is it going to be the U.S. or the Western nations led by the U.S. in the Middle East, or is it going to be Russia? And that ends up being the real battle, and that's why Iran can't be in place there as well.
You were the Deputy Commander of U.S. European Command. You were the architect of the Afghan air campaign in the very, very beginning part of that operation. And throughout your career, you've talked about the importance of diplomacy conjoined with military force. There are those who Certainly, what HR told us today was very much in keeping with a true big picture strategy, but there are those who look at what the administration is doing, for example, in the State Department and gutting its capabilities as being actually something that's going to hamper the resolution of any of these challenges. As somebody who wore the uniform but also listened very closely to your political advisors and your diplomatic advisors, how big of a problem is this?
I think the United States needs to be sophisticated across the board, whether it be diplomatic, economic, or military. All those tools need to be top-notch, need to be world-class, and we need to pay a lot of attention to all of them. I mean, preferably, most military people would prefer to have a diplomatic outcome before they go to war. So there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I kind of think the previous administration kind of heavily went toward, the theory would be if the world were only a good place to live, we wouldn't have to fight as much, so let's treat it that way. Well, it doesn't quite work that way. But yeah, I believe in diplomacy, and I think our State Department needs to be very strong. I'm not sure exactly if it's as problematic as people make it sound like in the news, but definitely. I just came back from Saudi Arabia. The embassy's up and running there. It's an important place with important people. But the economic part, we need to continue to be sophisticated at. He mentioned the hardest working people in the U.S. government are Treasury, looking at sanctions implementation, but also the military part. And there's some other, foreign aid has a part of the tool. So we need to be sophisticated across the board using all of our tools. But certainly, you have to have a credible military component because some people, there isn't any diplomacy they'll ever listen to. It's only strength.
On that strength part, everybody's expectation has been that we would be looking at, we were at the Reagan Library and Peace Through Strength, and the Reagan buildup was seen as a critical part of that. But folks have a tendency of forgetting that it was a very sharp, the money started going up in the Carter administration. It spiked for a few years under the Reagan administration, but then with Graham-Rudman, it dropped very, very sharply. And there are those who are looking now at the size of the debt, because at that time we didn't have as big of a debt as we do now. There is a concern that infrastructure is catching up, people are living longer, and that the debt will have to be handled. That's what we heard from Adam Smith, that he actually thinks that any enthusiasm about bigger defense spending is actually very misplaced. Do you feel the same, because you're looking at strategic trends and talk to pretty much everybody in Washington and elsewhere? The second piece of that is, how do we make this work in the event that we're not going to get more resources for the Pentagon?
I'm not an economist. I have two hands, but I'm not an economist. But I would say this. I mean, I think about this as you do. And right now, it isn't working. The tax situation we're in right now is not growing the economy. We've got a great stock market going on right now. We've got great interest rates that are low as ever, but we're not growing the economy. And the economy is part of our security. There's no doubt about it. Without it, we can't buy our military. Without it, we just aren't a strong nation. So I would say we should probably give this tax break a shot. I mean, there's all different types of controversy surrounding this, and you could take onesie-twosies out of this thing and probably have reason to criticize it. But if in fact it does work and it grows the economy, it's going to actually help our security tremendously. $700 billion in the world economy is a lot of money, but in the U.S. GDP, what are we at, 15, 16 trillion now, going toward 20 within probably 5 to 10 years?
Well, it's 20.6 trillion as of this morning.
Right, so 20.6, and we're spending less than 10% on the military, and we're probably the most engaged military
Sorry,
in the world.
hang on. That was the debt. So,
Okay.
okay.
We're at GDP about 16 or so trillion, and we're growing. Okay, so we just need to accept the fact that we are the lead nation in the world, like it or not. People say it's a responsibility for us to be the shining light in the hill. I like that term, but we also have the benefit of being in the lead. I used to kind of laugh a little bit when people would say in NATO, when we like NATO, it's us, and when we don't like NATO, it's them. We're always with NATO, for example. Now, the good news is we're in charge, and we say the other people ought to be paying their share, but in fact, we want to be in charge, and maybe it'll cost us a little more, but we want to. Same thing in the world. We want to be the world leader. We want to be able to hopefully mold the world as we see fit, as far as what our interests are and what our values are in America. That takes investment. So yeah, it's expensive. I think what I would say is I think we have a narrative problem a little bit. I don't think the American public has really been explained to what our situation in the world is, how dynamic it is. We kind of do it in parts, and there's a theory sometimes that the government's job, the President of the United States' job, let's say, is to put people at ease so they can live their lives in a peaceful way, right? After 9/11, right, one of the big things was go out and do some shopping, right? Well, okay, that's good, but they also need to realize without an investment in what we see as our values and what we want the world to be like, it's not going to be that way, so we have to do it.
But to make a comparison between President Bush, though, President Bush regularly, often, and daily tried to explain both the threat, why not to worry, what the next sort of challenges were, rightly or wrongly made a case for the war in Iraq. Whereas, is President Trump doing that? Because if anybody's going to take that message to the American people about America's global role, there are those who look at, for example, and say, he's not really making that case, especially when it's an America First message that tends to really drive our allies a little bit crazy.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I personally wish the president would do a little more McMaster in public. I thought HR did a good job of explaining at a strategic level in a very thoughtful and mature way what our values are, what our objectives are, what we need to do to get to that end state, a strategic way. On the other hand, there's a visceral and there's an intellectual, and then there's reality, whatever that is. I just came back from Saudi Arabia. The Saudis are very, very happy with where we're going as a country strategically, if you will. Other people have confidence in that. I mean, again, you listen to HR today and others, and you go, I can agree with that. I can agree with that approach. So I'm not here to criticize or evaluate the president's behavior, but from a broad administration standpoint, I think they're doing the right thing.
From a Saudi Arabia's perspective, how does the situation with Qatar get resolved? You use that operations center in Qatar, which is one of the most important bases we have in the world, particularly for that entire theater. And yet it's kind of a fundamental impasse between Saudi Arabia and its allies and Qatar and its allies. How does that get resolved?
I was actually the first American to go to Al Udeid and opened up the op center there, but here's what I would say. Nothing is simple. Things are strategic, and things are long-term. They don't stay as always the same way. But I would say that for the United States, for today, I would recommend we actually leave Qatar and go someplace else, whether that be Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia or Al Dhafra in the UAE, or maybe the new base in Jordan, let's say. But I think it's time for us to hold the line on Qatar. I mean, the fact is they're supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas. And the issue with Qatar is you can't have it both ways. You can't say on one hand we want to be part of the coalition against ISIS and be part of the GCC, and on the other hand support the Muslim Brotherhood. And anyway, I'd probably leave Qatar.
Now, a lighthearted question. So for all your youthful good looks, most people don't recognize that you're actually a Vietnam War aviator, and you flew. A lot of folks, talk about F-4. We recently talked to Ron Fogelman and Tony McPeak, both Misty FAC F-100 drivers. F-16 driver in the form of the current Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. You were also a fast jet guy, but back then you were flying an OA-2.
Right. The O2A.
Excuse me, O2A, belay my last, O2A.
Skymaster. It was a push and pull Cessna, small, slow mover, single person. There was room for four, but we had one pilot. And I was a forward air controller putting in airstrikes with U.S. controllers on the ground, but for the Vietnamese at the end of the war. It was a fantastic learning experience. We had 15 airplanes, pilots in my squadron shot down the ear of my roommate. One of them got the Medal of Honor, the other the Air Force Cross. So it was dicey times. You learn a lot as a second lieutenant, I'll tell you.
So you guys went from the single-ended bird dog to a positive, speedy airplane like that. What were the challenges, though, of that mission? Because you guys, even though you were a lot faster than the old airplane, you were still a lot slower than a bullet coming at you, and you guys were flying low enough to actually get shot at a lot. Talk to us about what that mission profile was like.
Well, it's interesting. When I first got over there, you fly 4 or 5 rides or sorties, flights with another pilot, IP, that trains you on the local rules of engagement, the war, where it is, where you're going, and how to do the mission with trying to direct Air Force, in this case, mostly Air Force, but Navy as well, fighters, at a target, sometimes under a jungle canopy. And then about the 6th ride, you go up by yourself. And on the way to the area, which was about a 45, 50-minute flight from Da Nang up toward the DMZ, I asked myself, how did you get yourself in this position? But no, it was good. You learn a lot. It's your pride. You have a lot of pride afterwards. I mean, you're out there on your own. We had several guys in my squadron who became prisoners of war. Were repatriated after the war. Dangerous. You get shot at a lot. As I said, we had 15 guys shot down, so you develop a lot of camaraderie, you develop a lot of self-confidence, you learn a lot about good and bad parts of how you actually employ, in this case, air power or military power writ large. The chain of command, we had as you maybe have read, you probably don't recall, the military wasn't in great shape then. Our military had changed dramatically after Goldwater Nichols. Vietnam was the catalyst for that. We were in tough shape in the military, mainly because of doctrine, leadership, and I think civilian leadership. McMaster wrote the book, Dereliction of Duty. I think that's probably worth reading.
And I should say that the airplane in question was the Cessna Skymaster, which as a kid was one of the airplanes I really loved and wanted to fly. So what was the Skymaster like to fly?
Oh, it was a piece of cake. It was fun. It was slow. It was long endurance. Most of my flights were 4.5 hours long, sometimes up to 6 or so, all by yourself. I did train Vietnamese at the end, and the first Vietnamese student I had, I remember his name was Nguyen Nguyen Hoa. I was training him out of Saigon, and he had 2,700 hours of combat time when I gave him his first flight, and he had been flying 01 bird dogs before, and he was nervous. It was kind of ironic, but not a very hard airplane to fly intentionally. So you could, spend more of your time using gyroscopically stabilized binoculars to try to find targets on the ground, and the idea was we found the targets most of the time based on some intelligence prediction areas, but you'd find a 130 millimeter artillery piece or a tank or a group of Viet Cong, and then the fighters would come in and you'd put your little white phosphorus rocket down where it was and direct the fighters in, and they'd bomb, and it was fun.
Willie, Pete, and you, how to
Absolutely.
succeed. Last question. As a Vietnam veteran, I've asked this, I asked General Fogelman this question, I asked General McPeak this question, and I'll ask you this question. And because Burns and Noack did that multi-part series on the Vietnam War, we talked to Joe Ralston also, and I asked him this. Was the war worth it ultimately, from your standpoint, given the sacrifices and where we ended up?
I personally think if we hadn't done it, we'd be about where we are today. So 56,000 lives. If there is anything good about the way combat has evolved in the U.S., a lot of good things, but it's that our casualties have been decreased significantly, even though we're in the just sub 10,000 for a 16-year war. But 56,000 there, and hopefully we'll continue to have wars that aren't quite as demanding casualty-wise. And I think Vietnam, retrospectively, probably was a mistake that at the time people didn't recognize. There was this big fear of communism, the domino theory. As you remember, we just had the nuclear process with the Russians in Cuba, and we were sure the boogeyman was coming at any moment. And so you look at good fortune or bad fortune, and if you have the right kind of, I always, like I told the Saudi Arabians last week, I said there's 2 ways that change occurs. Either you're going to have a crisis or you have prescient leadership. And 99% of the times a crisis occurs because we just don't have prescient leadership. And if you do, you're very fortunate.
General Wald, as always, a pleasure, sir. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Vago. I appreciate it. Good questions. You did your homework.